Good to see you. Sorry I missed the board meeting last month, but I saw that Andrew got you out here in record time. So he put a little bit of pressure on me.
Yeah, no pressure. No pressure.
So, for our meeting today, let me announce who we have in attendance. Myself, Chair Sanzeri, we have Vice Chair Gardner, Trustee Griarty, Trustee Lanza, Trustee Menon, Trustee Muyo, Trustee Oswald, Trustee Santos, and Trustee Votto. We have our CEO, Roberto Peria, our CIO, Prabhu Palani, and we have Counsel Jeff Rieger here with us today. So we don't have any orders of the day or items for waiving of sunshine. We're going to go right into closed session, and hopefully we'll be out in not too long a period of time. Back on track. Sorry for the long delay. Let's move on through, there's no orders of the day. Let's move on to the consent calendar. Do I have a motion to approve? Okay. Do I have a second? Okay. Motion from Trustee Santos, second by Trustee Votto. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Motion carries.
There's another motion. I don't want to hear any more about investment.
I don't want to pull, I don't want to
You
pull
might
any
want to take a
items.
break and walk around the block there.
I don't want to pull, I'm not pulling any items, Mr. Chair, but I wanted to make sure that your board pays attention to item 1.3D. That's a communication that went out to retirees regarding the launch of our new member direct portal. Just to, if you have any questions, you can see me after the meeting and I can address them, but I just wanted to make that reference. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, Dick, we are on to agenda item 2, which is investments.
That's a great subject. Great subject.
Oral update from our CIO.
After hearing me speak for an hour and 20 minutes, I'm not sure you want to hear me again. I'm happy to take questions, Mr. Chair. I don't have any prepared comments besides my presentation at the closed session. If not, we can move on to performance.
Okay. Any questions?
No, just a comment. I think, we had a grand jury report. We've had all kinds of information related to investments, and I think our IC, our investment committee, is doing a great job. I think this board's doing a great job. It is frustrating. It's long, but we're doing the best we can to make sure that those investments pay off, so it's a great job.
Thank you. Okay. Item 2B, presentation of the first quarter 2019 private market reports by Makita.
Good morning.
Morning.
As a reminder, my name is Chris Theodore from Makita Investment Group. We'll be discussing the first quarter private markets program report. I wanted to start with an estimate for the retirement plan. Markets have been very strong in the year-to-date period, but we have seen some volatility in the past couple of days, so I figured I'd give an update there. We estimate the plan on a year-to-date basis is up 7.5%. We estimate that in the fiscal year-to-date period, the plan is down roughly 80 basis points. In the past week or so, we've seen the Dow Jones drop roughly 800 to 900 points. I thought it might be helpful to provide an estimate. Continuing through to the private markets report, this is titled Private Markets Program March 31st, 2019 Public Version. As a reminder, staff does receive a private version with a bit more details pertaining to specific assets by the managers. We'll start on page 3 of the report. The retirement plan's private markets program consists of legacy private equity, Neuberger Fund of One, private debt, real estate, and real assets. It spans roughly $1.35 billion in committed capital, which has achieved a net IRR of 8.1%. Digging into asset class returns, we'll flip through to page 5, starting with private debt. Private debt consists of nearly $500 million in committed capital to 10 private debt partnerships and 1 co-investment. This represents roughly 5.4% of the retirement plan versus a 4% policy target. During the first quarter of 2019, there were roughly $18 million in contributions to the private debt program and roughly $3 million in distributions with no new commitments. I'd like to continue on to page 8, which details some performance returns for your managers. As a reminder, within private markets, IRR and net investment multiple are the most meaningful measures of return. You'll see those columns in 4th from the right and 3rd from the right in this performance report on page 8. The net IRR of 5.5% and the multiple of 1.2 times are unchanged from the previous quarter. And kind of framing the time period for this report being through the first quarter of 2019, we'd like to kind of characterize the market environment that we experienced. You know, as a reminder, in the 4th quarter of 2018, we saw very weak markets, in particular December, which was historically weak, before the recovery in the first quarter of 2019, which was primarily driven by A, a strong domestic economy, and B, some dovish Federal Reserve commentary, which resulted later on, subsequent to the first quarter, in the Powell pivot and lowering of interest rates. Continuing through to the real estate program on page 12. As of March 31st, the real estate program consisted of $216 million of committed capital to 13 real estate funds, representing 2.5% of the plan versus a 3% target. So a more mature, close to policy asset class. During the quarter, in the first quarter of 2019, we saw $5.4 million in contributions, $5.1 million in distributions, and no new commitments within real estate. And then flipping through to page 15, we note some manager performance. The total real estate program net IRR was 13.9%, with some of the more recent contributions contributing nicely. The more recent contributions represent roughly 30-ish% of the program. That's contributions in the last 2 to 3 years. And you'll note that some of those returns are designated by an NM on this report, which is not meaningful, noting that private markets investments have a J-curve effect in recognizing returns throughout the process. And while it's pretty early in the lifespan of those investments, the returns so far are not meaningful compared to some of your more mature investments, which have net IRRs, investment multiples, and are comparable to the benchmark. So within real estate, similar to private debt, we've seen returns in the asset class driven by the low interest rate environment. Despite vacancy rates decreasing slightly in the quarter-over-quarter period, we saw landlords command nice pricing power in the space, being able to increase rents slightly given the strong U.S. economy.
Do you know how much California exposure there is with rent control coming?
I do not have that number off the top of my head, California exposure in the program. I could definitely.
Real estate, real assets,
Real estate, I guess.
real estate. Brian?
Continuing through, if there's no further questions on real estate, we'll go to the real assets program. That starts on page 19. As of the first quarter of 2019, the real assets program had $46 million in committed capital to 3 partnerships, representing about 1% of the plan versus a 3% target. Contributions for real assets in the first quarter consisted of $2.1 million, while distributions consisted of $0.7 million on no new commitments in the quarter. We'll note that subsequent to the end of the quarter, you'll note on page 21, there were 2 commitments, one within energy to Kimmeridge 5, and one within infrastructure to Global Infrastructure Partners 4, that we'll hope to see investment returns for in future reports. On page 22, we dig into some of the manager returns within real assets. The real assets program is still maturing. The bulk of performance consists of 2 investments from vintage year 2016 that you see in this report, with 40 of the $46 million being invested in that vintage year 2016 investments. Nice performance driven by those 2 infrastructure investments in 2016, contributing to the 11.8% net IRR that we see in the total program. And then we see in vintage year 2017, the energy investment with Lime Rock Partners 8. And as I mentioned, the possibility of adding these 2 new investments to future reports. You continue through the report, and in our appendix section, we do note some market commentary for various aspects of the private markets program. I'm going to skip this market commentary, but if there are any specific questions, I'm happy to answer.
Do you think the rent control depresses valuation in California?
I do think rent control in general, if we're not just talking about the California area, decreases valuation. Anytime in finance where you put a floor or a ceiling on prices, you're not allowing things to normalize to regular pricing. So as a financial concept, I'm not sure that it is additive, but as a social concept, I think that's a very different argument.
Can you comment a little bit about the private debt with a net IRR of 5.5%? How does that compare to the vintage, the 2010 vintage year private debt?
Sure. We'll note that the bulk of this program's commitments were in 2010 and also 2013. And to be frank, these investments have not performed up to snuff with their benchmark. These are legacy investments by previous staff with different investment consultant. But that being said, the net IRR is pretty well below what we would have expected in that period from other managers. So you'll note the vintage year 2010 net IRR of 4.2% compares to the 10% benchmark net return in that year.
Maybe I'll add to that. Personally, I'd consider that an unacceptable IRR for this asset class. And that is something that we're very diligent about as we're analyzing new investments, is understanding the organization and how they're approaching the market as well as the macro opportunity, rather than getting caught up in the marketing, demonstrating that they can perform across a variety of environments and structuring contracts that are appropriate for what they're trying to execute on. And that's something that you can see in, call it post-2014 investments, is an increased focus on strategies that will return capital quickly and partnerships that have well-established track records in established strategies.
So what is the time frame when the capital is returned now versus what it used to be before? When the time frame when the money is returned now versus when we were investing before, the more illiquid you're saying in the past?
What I'm saying is that the fund structures allow for various investment periods, drawdowns, recyclings, and we're very cognizant of how those terms in a partnership agreement influence what's done inside the fund.
One observation I want to make is that the concern when the sponsor is looking at the amount of fees that we're paying on our plan, they typically will look at alternative investments. This is primarily in the space that you're reviewing here. And some of these asset classes are actually doing well. If you look at real estate, if you look at private equity, I believe the returns look pretty attractive. Alternatively, in the private debt, you pointed out disappointment, and we may see the same thing when we talk about absolute return. But in the performance reports that come to the board, I noticed the last quarter when it was reviewed last month, I wasn't here for that meeting, but the full data is not available in those reports. So in private debt, it didn't show a 5-year number, yet we've had a program that's been in place for 5 years. And in private real estate, it didn't show a 5 or 10-year number. We've been in private real estate for more than 5 years. So if you can take a look at that, so the next quarterly report is more comprehensive. I think it's important that when we talk to stakeholders, we have the data to support what parts of our absolute return or alternative investments are working and which parts are not, rather than the entire approach being painted with a negative brush.
We appreciate that feedback, and we'll definitely look into that.
Thank you.
You know, another observation I wanted to make,
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, is that if you look at page 5, we just coincidentally happen to have a much higher allocation to the asset that has performed below expectations.
Yep. Very true. Good. Any other questions or comments on this? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Old business, we have no items on the agenda today. Moving to new business, oral update from our CEO.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just, if you bear with me, just 2 or 3 minutes, I have a list of things I want to update you on. The first one is that, as directed by your board to the chair to work with staff and fiduciary council, the responses to the grand jury were actually completed. They were issued, they were actually shared. They were provided to OER and the city council for the reference, and we actually delivered them or mailed them this past week to the presiding judge, which the deadline was October 1st, had been extended, if you recall, for 2 weeks. And we did it toward the end of last week, so it was received on time. I also want to keep you apprised on the city clerk process for the fire member election process is ongoing, and it actually ends, the application process ends on Friday, October 4th, so it ends tomorrow. So if there are any outstanding issues, they should be resolved by tomorrow, so that people can continue, if they want to remain at the board, those that are fire and active members, they can continue their appointment with the board for the next 4 more years. We attended, and I want to thank publicly Chair Sinceri. He was nice enough to attend with staff the council member meeting last Tuesday, where we were scheduled to present the fee report for 2018. Unfortunately, we were not able to make the presentation. There was a lengthy discussion and a couple of items for the council member meeting, and so it has been deferred to next week. So we are now on board for next week, same time, same place. And we're looking forward to present the report to the council members, but no one is looking more forward to it than Prabhu himself. I have Cheryl Parkman here this morning. I will get to it in a second on providing an update to your board on the CalPERS plan, but we'll get to that in a second. I wanted to let you know, we have been working internally, and I want to big kudos to Dinesh, one of our investment officers. It is hard to believe that our 5-year lease for the location where we have our offices ends on March 2020. And so we have been looking at other options. I think it's just really due diligence to make sure that we getting the best book for our money and the best place. And we are also in negotiations with the owner of the building as we speak, where we stay, where we are now. But I wanted to mention Dinesh has done excellent work looking at options. We have actually visited some other similar buildings in the area, and so I will keep you posted as to what the negotiations are going, how they're going, and what the end result will be. But wanted to let you know that that's part of the work that we are working on right now. Visited with my peers last week. We have a annual basis. It's called a CalPERS, California Association of Public Retirement Systems Administrators Institute, where we all get together to speak about issues that are happening in our specific plans, but also a day and a half of education for us. And in a way, we get together and, talk about our boards and staff and everyone. It's just a way to really share information. And one of the things that I wanted to know is my counterpart in Orange County, which is well known to Reed Smith and particularly to Harvey, I was speaking to him because he has this idea of sometimes going around to visit other plans, visiting just not their offices, but also attending the board meetings. And I just think that's an excellent idea, and I try to push that thought with my peers, where maybe we should start thinking about every one of us attending each other board meetings, maybe not in 1 year, but over a period of years, so that we can see not only the interaction, but what is the difference with your board meetings versus my board meetings, and where we can add some value, just getting to know how business is conducted in other areas of the state. Nothing really came out of it, but I think it's an excellent idea. Open enrollment for healthcare for retirees will take place, it goes from November 1st to the 30th, but we have, November 6th, we have a healthcare meeting where we bring vendors and everything else at our offices. That will happen on November 6th, 2019. You may recall that one of the issues that we have put on the side the last couple of years for our budget is the communications part of it, meaning kicking back and issuing new newsletters and everything else. I mentioned to you, as part of this year's budget, we actually allocated some money to hire a communications consultant. We met with her, and I wanted to let you know our goal is to kick off again the quarterly newsletter starting January 2020. So I will keep you apprised. The idea is, number one, to issue the first newsletter of this approach January 2020, and towards the second half of the fiscal year, the goal also is to bring to your board for review a strategic planning on really a communications plan that really utilizes social media. So that's also a plan towards the second half of the year to bring that forward to your board for decision. I also wanted to let you know that Tier 2 rehires members that went back to Tier 1. You may recall there was a lot of discussion, and you approved those retirement rates that are different than the regular retirement rates. The statements are going out this week. Is that correct, Robert?
That is correct.
To those members? The member statements on the retirement contributions. Our new IT manager started at our office last September 23rd. We also had a new accounting clerk starting on September 23rd. Our new financial analyst for the investment section, I believe, is scheduled to start this coming Monday, October 7th. And the new office specialist front desk is to start on October 21st. So we have quite a few new members either starting, that have started already, or starting very soon this month at our office. And finally, the senior analyst recruiting is still ongoing, and we're hoping to have a senior analyst on board. I think our goal is to have them hopefully this month. That concludes my update, Mr. Chair.
Any questions?
Oh,
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yes, I apologize. If Cheryl can provide you board with an update on the CalPERS benefit, that would be helpful. Thank you, Cheryl. Sorry to put you in the spot like that, but I'm sure you have very good things to say.
Thank you, Roberto. Cheryl Parkman, Office of Employee Relations. As Roberto mentioned, we have been working with Retirement Services to try and put our investment professional staff, as well as the CIO and CEO into, or not the incumbent CEO, but future CEOs into the CalPERS benefit. So you may recall that we did try to get an ordinance passed, but it had to be pulled and deferred because CalPERS did contact us to work with them a little bit further. So the city has been in contact with CalPERS. They have requested some additional information, which we have provided. And it is my knowledge that they are reviewing that additional information to then provide us with an additional timeline or to ask us any questions of anything additional that we need to complete. So we are working with CalPERS directly on making sure that we get them whatever they need from us so that we can get these members into that CalPERS plan.
Any questions?
Thank you, Cheryl.
You're very welcome.
Cheryl, thank you for coming to give us that update. Appreciate
Oh,
it.
absolutely. And if I may ask, I know that you just had a question about not question, but an update about the account member statements for Tier 2 to Tier 1. I think just the Office of Employee Relations would like to be included on any of those member statements, just so we know that they're going out in case we get questions about it, because we've been the main contact for those employees about any changes to their retirement benefits.
That's a fair request, and we'll make sure that that's the case. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Roberto, I have one question.
Yes.
Although it doesn't affect us directly, this board, but it does affect us indirectly, because I have been to some joint meetings where there has been lack of quorum on the other side from the federated side. Can you update us on the recruitment?
Yes, very good point. So, Federated actually just welcomed a new trustee last month at the first meeting. They had 2 openings, and then the second opening is actually one where you have the same one here, and the member that occupies that seat is actually Drew Lanza, where you board actually interview candidates and then send a recommendation to City Council. We were lucky, Drew was the only candidate, but we were lucky that obviously the board as well thought highly of Mr. Lanza, and so
And the best candidate.
it was certain, you were the best.
Come on,
And
be
yet the
honest.
worst, because you were only
Exactly.
one, but
Owe
nevertheless.
me a beer.
Yes. So on the next meeting this month in October, that same seat is going to be addressed at the federal board. They have 2 candidates that the board is going to interview, and then they will recommend one of those candidates to City Council for appointment, so that November, for the first time in some time, the board will have a full board. However, that November month is also the last month of the chair, Matt Lodge. He's been with the plan for about 12 years, and I believe 10 of them as chair. He's going to be missed. If you're watching, Matt, we'll miss you. And so after that, then what's going to happen is that the city clerk, I believe, Linda, is actually running also an opening or not yet. They're running an election so that I think the goal is to have someone being selected and appointed by the city council in time for the December meeting for Federated. So hopefully going forward, it's going to be fully staffed, all 7 positions, and we'll have better options when we have joint meetings.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good question. Any more questions? Okay, thank you. Item B, oral update from the City Council Liaison to the board.
Thank you for sitting through a very long city council meeting, and, which actually ended up going until 10 o'clock that night. So I'm sorry you sat there and you didn't get to your
We were
item,
happy to
but-
be dismissed at 4:30.
Yeah, be happy that occurred. I look forward to participating on the working group that starts its work in 2 weeks to see, to talk about various issues on possibly consolidating the 2 boards as recommended by the grand jury report and other items. Everything's on the table as far as a discussion, so I look forward to being a part of that. And a couple weeks ago, the city council adopted a state of a climate emergency in the city of San Jose, and which will result, part of the resolution was disavowing any investments in businesses that had a negative impact on the environment. The question came up that the Federated and Police and Fire Retirement Boards might want to take a look at that too. I don't know where that has gone or whether you've heard anything along those lines.
Yes, let me address that issue. Actually, Ms. Parkman, who is our liaison and contact person for the staff for the city, did reach out to me, and we had a conversation, and I believe she's working internally with the city to put together a memo for the board. I think, if I'm misspoke, please correct me. I think the goal of the city is to start with the federal board at the meeting on October 17. Subsequently, that memo will come before your board for your November meeting. Is that correct, Cheryl?
That's correct.
Yes.
And I'll also point out that it was probably 3-4 months ago, at one of the investment committee meetings, they had a topic specifically about ESG investing, which addressed that topic. It was very educational in nature. It was not action-oriented, but at least there was a discussion point that happened there.
Great, I just wanted to raise it as an awareness item, that's something the city is committed to, and how that relates to the retirement boards is a different matter.
And I also like to point out, I think, Ms. Foley, you commented on the retirement task force. Is that what you were referring
The
to?
working group, yeah,
Yeah, that the mayor put together.
yeah,
And that happens, I believe the first meeting is it October 15?
I think that's right.
I know Sherry is walking
two
here
Tuesdays.
to correct me, or maybe make a
Tuesday
statement.
after Columbus Day, whatever day that is.
Yes, we're actually taking a memo next Tuesday on the membership and logistics of that working group to council, so on the 8th. We are proposing to push back our first meeting until November because there is a very short turnaround time from that October 8th meeting to after Columbus Day. So we are hoping to start in November for a term of about 6 months. And then at the end of 6 months, there will be probably a list of recommendations from that working group that will be presented to full city council. Yes,
Understood.
so there, so if you, I'm happy to forward that memo on to Roberto, and he can share that with the group.
I'll make a part of communication. Thank you for the update. A couple of things. There are members from this board, federated, that are part of that retirement task force. And so
That's correct.
Our, Mr. Palani, our CIO, and myself, we look forward to working with the retirement task force and the meetings. And I think you and I spoke about this before. Is the goal, is the task force really expecting us to kick off with the presentation on the plans? Is that still the expectation? And if so, can we get some direction on what they're looking for? Just wanted to make sure that that was understood, so.
Absolutely. So the working group really is meant to be a collaborative space where everyone can get on the same page about the different statuses of the plan. So we are going to be looking for Roberto and Prabhu to be maybe doing a very similar presentation to what they presented in front of the joint council and retirement board meeting, where you talked about the status of the plan and the investment allocation. So we're not looking to really deviate from that, but of course, we can talk more about that online. There are some members of the working group that don't have the same experience as many of you board members, and of course, Roberto and Prabhu. So we want to make sure everyone has that same advantage.
Cheryl, that first meeting was supposed to take place in September, so now it's pushed out 2 months. Can you give us a sense of the delay?
Sure. So we did need to go to city council in order to approve the membership and logistics of that particular working group. I can be honest with you and tell you that we were not expecting to need to go to city council to get that approved. So that's the cause of the delay. And so you can put that on me and my staff. But we are hoping to kick off. We are, expected to kick off in November, and from there on, it will be a full 6 months.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
That's it.
I have a question. Or you have
Yo,
more?
you have a question for me?
I do.
Oh, okay.
Not for you. Not for you, Cheryl. You're good to go.
Okay, go for it.
But if you have more, you can continue.
No, I'm done. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Knowing that there's already a presentation put together for city council on the fee disclosure and report for both plans, and the meeting was deferred, so it actually gives it even more time to think about that. Are there specific things for you specifically as a council member, or possibly your knowledge of your peers, that it's important to hear at that meeting about those fees, or questions that you might have that we should be thinking about in anticipation of the meeting?
Well, they've all seen, thanks for asking, they've all seen the grand jury report and the passive rate of return and the recommendation from the grand jury that we consider more passive investments and therefore less fees. So I'm sure that the council will focus on that component when you look at the comparison of other plans and how they're managed with the greater return and lower cost. That's a question with the city because of the unfunded liability and what that results into the actual costs to the city. So I would think that would be a key component and the main thing that they want to focus on, and why we would not want to look more at passive investments versus the more active types that managed assets that we have.
Got it, got it. And,
Does that help?
It does. And to that point, I know there was a meeting with City Council on that topic specifically. Was that one of the things that was discussed amongst the grand jury report? Okay,
Yeah.
okay, good.
We
Probably
did
any
not-
questions?
Regarding just about the grand jury report, we did not spend much time on the grand jury report either. We really took the report, we responded, the city council actually objected to everything that the grand jury recommended. So we felt the report was that we accept what you're saying, but we may not be changing anything. We are considering looking at merging the two boards. I know that's looked at before, and that was one recommendation from the grand jury. So we didn't spend a lot of time analyzing the grand jury report.
Okay, so I have seen the city's responses. Has it been distributed to the entire board?
No,
The
it
city's
has not.
responses?
And I will, that's a good point. Along with the communication, we'll include that in your next meeting so that you can have it as well. They did share that with us, and we'll make it available.
Okay, all right. Prabhu, did you have any questions regarding the upcoming meeting? And
No, I think the mandate's pretty clear on what's expected of us, so we'll be prepared.
Great, okay, thank you. Dick?
Yeah, I want to say that back in, I believe it was 95, mid-90s, the Police and Fire Retirement Board had something called the Sullivan Principles. And it had to do with apartheid at the time in South Africa with investments. So what the council member is saying, we did that, and you have receipts here, how we went about it.
Okay.
And you know, when it comes to investments, you got to divest slowly because of the amount of funding or whatever have you. But that's something that we did during that time, and it turned out to be very good. That's
Yeah.
the environment now.
Right. Okay,
I don't know that that will come up at the council meeting, but you should be prepared to answer the question if it does.
okay. Ficus?
The force meetings, are they going to be open to the public?
I
Usually-
imagine they would
I would
be.
think
Usually
have
they
public
are,
meetings,
usually
Yeah,
usually they're open to the public.
I mean, they're not gonna be a council meeting, but I'd be very, let me put it this way, I'll be very surprised if they're not open meetings.
I would too. Anytime council members, this meeting is open to a public, anytime a council member is appointed to a group, it's a public meeting. So there's probably an opportunity even for public comment at some
Yes.
point. I don't know.
I would think
really.
so, yeah. Unfortunately, Chair
chairing,
just
so I
stepped
don't
out for a
really-
second, so.
Yeah,
okay. Any more questions? Thank you for the update.
thanks.
Okay. 4C, actually, I think in tandem, we're going to be covering 4C and D, given the report in front of you ties this together. This is part of a few months of work that happens beginning typically here in the fourth quarter as we start to look at the economic and demographic expectations and assumptions that we have for the plan. I'll turn it over to Bill and Ann. Thank you.
Morning. I'm Bill Hallmark, and this is Ann Harper. And yeah, we're excited to get started on another year of actuarial work for the plan. Roberto reminds me that this is my favorite time of year when we get to do all this work. But just to lay out the plan and get you oriented before we start diving in, today we're presenting the economic assumptions and some potential adjustments to the amortization schedules for your consideration. This is an action item, but you do have the option of deferring decisions on these until the November board meeting. We split this up because at the November board meeting, we'll be presenting the demographic experience study that covers assumptions like retirement rates, mortality, and all of those things. and we'll also have some preliminary valuation results. And so at that time, we want all the decisions, if possible, on all the assumptions and all the methods, so that we can produce the final pension valuation report for December. And then OPEB we do in January and February board meetings. So just a reminder of where we were from the 2018 valuation. The 18 valuation determined the contribution rates for the current year, the fiscal year end 2020. The city's contribution rate covering both tiers and police and fire is 82.6% of pay, and the average member contribution rate's 11.9%. Those were not significant changes from the prior year. The city rate did go up a bit, but part of that is we decreased the discount rate from 6.875 to 6.75 was part of that increase. The red line there shows the normal cost. That's the expected cost of the benefits for the current year of service. So all the contributions above that are going to pay for the UAL. And up to the blue line, they're just paying the interest on the unfunded liability. And so all the contributions above the blue line are actually reducing the amount, the dollar amount of the UAL each year. We are contributing a significant amount above the blue line. So this plan is driving that UAL down through contributions.
Bill, on this page, I have one question. The normal cost, would that be the cost if the plan was fully funded?
Yes.
Okay. And when you say the blue line, that's the line that is running across just a little above 70%?
Yes, this
Okay.
line right here, if you can see the arrow. We call it tread water because if you contribute that amount, you're just treading water in terms of the UAL. You're paying for the new benefits that are earned and you're paying the interest on the unfunded.
Right. So the UAL is, without getting into the nitty-gritty, what is it about 3 billion, something of that?
You can kind of see it on the right-hand chart here. So the right-hand chart, the bars represent the liability, the actuarial liability split between those in pay. The gold is people who have a deferred benefit but are no longer working for the city. And the red is the people still working for the city, the active employees. The green and blue lines are the market value and actuarial value of assets. So the unfunded liability is the difference between this line and the top of the bar. And so that looks like about $1 billion here.
Yeah, as of the last fiscal year, it was $1,093,000,000.
Yeah.
The 77% is referring to the dots.
The 77, right, the 77% is the funded ratio based on the actuarial value. So we have 77% of the assets that we are targeting. So the actuarial liability represents kind of our funding target, where we think the assets should be at this point in time. And we only have 77% of what we think we should have.
So if the city were to write a check for $1 billion, then you would be fully funded?
The plan
You know,
would be
roughly.
fully funded, yes.
Right. And when it's fully funded, is the assumption that the plan is then invested in the asset allocation? Or is it invested in treasuries? Can you just define that for us?
This is a very important distinction. This means we're fully funded, meaning we have the target amount of assets that we've set based on the assumed rate of return of 6.75. It does not mean that we have enough assets to absolutely guarantee benefits without future contributions, because we still have the risks of that investment return. If we wanted to guarantee without future contributions other than normal costs, then we would have to invest in a matching portfolio of treasuries, or depending on what level of credit quality you want. And we would need significantly more assets to do that.
So that would be at something of the order of twice that, given that, you know, AA corporates will probably get you about 3%.
Yeah, if AA corporates are 3%, it's going to be quite a bit more. We can, when we flip to the model, I can get a closer estimate to that. Although with that big of a change, it's really an estimate.
Okay.
Bill, I have a quick question on the left-hand side of this, the Treadwater portion of it. Can you give us a sense each year of what is contributing to the growth of the UAL if nothing else changes? I'm assuming it's our discount rate is added on.
Yeah, so each year when we do the valuation, we give a breakout. And the first level breakout is 5 different categories that we identify. Any benefit changes, so Measure F was the last time we had something on that front. Any assumption changes, so last year, and assumption changes have been a large component of our growth in UAL over the last 10 years. Investment experience, liability experience, and then the effect of contributions.
So if all those 5 things you listed stayed constant and nothing changed, the UAL would increase regardless, simply because of our assumed rate of, our discount rate.
Well, that's built into the contribution piece. If the contribution was just the normal cost, then yes, the UAL would increase with interest. But if the contribution covers the Treadwater, then you'd see no change in the UAL.
Right. And I guess what I'm trying to get to for a specific number as an example is that if we use $1 billion, we walk into the year, we only make a normal cost contribution, the UAL has gone up from 1 billion to 1,067 million roughly.
Yeah.
Are there any other contributing factors beyond the assumed return that would grow that if all these other factors stayed constant?
Right. No, there aren't.
Okay.
If all of our assumptions were met and we didn't change assumptions, didn't change benefits, and contributed the normal cost, that's it.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
And so this is the projections we showed at the last valuation. And so you can see from the top graph, the gray bars are the liability, and then the blue line is the market value of assets. There's a green line there that's kind of covered up behind it. That's the actuarial value. But we're projecting to be fully funded by 2035 and to be 90% funded by 2026 if all of our assumptions are met again. The bottom chart shows the projection of contributions, and we'll come back to this when we get to the amortization adjustments. But you can see there is a projected increase in 2021. So 2020 was the rate we set from the last valuation. 2021, we're projecting an increase of almost 3% of pay in the contribution rate. And that's because of our asset smoothing. We're smoothing in the losses from 2015 and 16 still. And so we've got 2 years of projected increases based on smoothing those losses in. And then we have this pattern where we go down and up and then drop down significantly. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, but this was the expectation from the last valuation before reflecting any of the changes since then. So just a reminder, we review the economic assumptions every year. The demographic assumptions we review every other year. We're reviewing them this year. These assumptions will affect the 2021 contributions. And all of the things we're talking about are going to affect the pension and the OPEB, except for the discount rate. We will come back to talk about the discount rate for the OPEB plan, and that's because you have a different investment policy for the 115 trust, and so we have to apply the capital market assumptions to that policy. The other thing I would note is in the past, we've only talked about price inflation, wage inflation, and the discount rate. We didn't have the line on the amortization payment increase rate. Typically, we've just set that as equal to wage inflation. And at the retreat last year, we talked about some potential changes to that. So we're identifying it as a separate assumption this year to address. So with that, I'll let Ann get into the details here.
Good morning. I'm going to start out talking about price inflation because this is the assumption that is the building block or foundation, if you will, for all the other economic assumptions. Currently, the price inflation assumption for your plan is 2.75%, and that has been unchanged since 2016. The biggest largest direct impact that inflation could have on a pension valuation is with the COLA assumption, the cost of living increases for your retirees. But since your tier 1 COLAs are fixed at 3%, regardless of what inflation is, and then your tier 2 COLAs equal inflation, but they're capped at 2%, price inflation has very little direct impact on your pension plan.
Annie, I have a question on this. You
Yeah.
say here, tier 1 is 3%, that's the COLA?
Yes.
And what's the guaranteed purchasing power? Is that is different?
It's a provision where the older retirees will maintain a certain purchasing power, but it's only a few, probably prior to 1980, that the people who retired prior to 1980 would get this provision. So it's very, very few people.
And how is it calculated? What's the index for purchasing power?
75%.
75% of their of the original benefit adjusted
Right.
for inflation.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So we look to.
One more question, sorry.
Sure.
On page 6, on tier 2, the inflation up to a maximum of 2%, what's inflation? Is that?
CPI. Yeah, for San Jose, yes.
For San Jose?
Oakland, San Francisco.
Yeah.
something like that.
Right, the Bay Area, yeah.
Okay.
So we look to economic forecasters and your peer group's inflation assumption to look at setting the price inflation. We look at it just to form a context of what other people are thinking and what other people are doing. And the left-hand bars on this graph show the economic forecasters and the Horizon Survey. And the Horizon Survey is compiled of about 35 different investment consultants. And their projections for inflation are very consistent with each other. About 2.2% is the median for both of those professional forecasters. And then when you look to those right two floating bars, those are actual assumptions for public systems. The left hand, the wider range there is the public plan database, which consists of about 200 public plans nationwide. So state plans, city, local plans, but all across the country. And then our California survey looks just specifically at plans in California, those that participate in CalPERS, SACRs, and some few transit plans. So looking at those assumptions, the public plan database is, the median's 2.75%, and then the California public plans are ranging about the median's about 3%. So a little bit higher than those forecasters because there's a slight lag in how public sector pension plans, how those assumptions are set. There's a lag in the timing there. We're slower to react.
So Annie, I just have one question.
Sure.
The 4% inflation, we haven't seen that inflation for, I think, about 2 decades. So I'm just wondering, what's the quality of this data? Is it very stale data?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, so the public plan database is maintained by Boston College, is Center for Retirement Research. And they just load data from financial reports from pension plans across the country. We're showing there are potential issues with the quality of the data when you get out to the maximums. We've seen errors in the database. I don't know if a 4% maximum is an error or if somebody is actually still assuming 4%. But that's not actual inflation, that's what they are choosing to assume. And 4% is very much an outlier. You can see how far it extends from the rest of the pack.
Bill, can I ask a quick question? Maybe you can help me. I guess I was surprised by the fact that the median for the public plan database is 2.75, but for the California plans is 3. I would expect it to be the opposite.
Yeah, so you're putting us in speculative territory here, but traditionally, over the last decade at least, the California plans have been more conservative in their assessments of different economic measures, primarily the discount rate, but also quicker to recognize that inflation was moving down. I think the other aspect that affects California plans is that inflation in the state of California has been higher than it has been nationally. And so I'm speculating, but I think that may be part of the reason that California plans have been a little bit slower to reduce their assumption, particularly if their COLA is based on California inflation and not on national inflation.
Which most are based on the California inflation. So if they lowered their inflation assumption, they would, to be consistent, would need to lower their cost of living adjustments for the retirees, right? And then that would be being, I would say not being very conservative and not, so that's kind of a hindrance for why they wouldn't lower it.
So, Bill, when did you start doing your actuarial work? What year roughly? 90s? I know, that's not a question,
It's
right?
an interview.
Yeah, come on, Bob, spit it out, Bob, come on. Bill,
It was
sorry.
mid to late 80s.
Yeah, so Bill, in the early 90s, if you'd seen something like this, if you stepped into a time machine and brought this back, they would have laughed you out of your office, right? This is
Yeah,
unusual.
If I projected 4% inflation in the 80s, yeah, that
Yeah,
would have
people
been
would say you're out
pretty
of your
funny.
flipping mind. So would I be correct in reading this, since this is broad surveys across a broad number of people, we asked this question last time, there is general consensus among pension plans, economic forecasters, that something very fundamental has changed with regard to inflation. That's a fair statement, right?
Inflation, interest rates,
Yeah.
yeah.
Something has changed. And so when we use historical data, that doesn't make any sense.
Agreed.
Thank you.
I actually have a follow-up question, though.
Ask Ann what time she became actuary.
In looking at this information, I guess what I'm thinking as a trustee is what's driving my decision? Is it the forecast or is it the COLA? Because the COLA is going up regardless of what inflation is, unless you think inflation is going to be higher than the COLA. So shouldn't you be thinking primarily at the COLA right now if we're running at a very low inflation rate?
Well, the tier one, they receive a 3% COLA regardless of inflation, right? So when you're looking at tier two and they're capped at 2%, as long as your assumption is higher than the 2%, it won't have any impact on your valuation.
Okay, so let me restate that, make sure I got this clear.
Sure.
Regardless of what our weight is in assets, membership between Tier 1 and Tier 2. If we set the inflation rate at 2%, it doesn't in any way take us backwards.
Are you saying in terms of the discount rate then?
Well, we're talking about price inflation.
Right.
Price
Okay,
inflation.
Right.
So if we were to adjust our price inflation, which right now
Right.
is 2.75 down to 2, does that hurt us in any way financially by using such a low price inflation number?
Well, the key to, like I said, it has no direct impact on your valuation. The key really is the wage inflation. So it's if you set your price inflation at 2%, your wage inflation currently is 3.25%. So you would implicitly then raise your wage or your real wage increase to be so that you don't decrease your wage inflation, so you can keep your wage inflation constant. Does that make?
The issue is all of the economic assumptions need to be consistent. And so the inflation forms the first building block. And so if you make a significant adjustment to that, now you may be affecting what the other assumptions are.
Okay.
So we want a consistent set of assumptions that reflect a reasonable economic view of the future.
So, bless you. So having said that, one last statement, quick question. Does that then follow that, based on my question that I asked about public plan database and California public pension plans, then, because California public pension plans have been quicker than other plans in the country to decrease the discount rate, then somehow California plans are really assuming a considerably lower real rate of return than our peers across the nation. So there must be something we know that they don't know, or vice versa. Am I right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think your conclusion makes sense. The question is, do we know more or less?
Yes, that's the question, yeah. Okay.
So we also look at a more empirical measure of inflation, which is called the break-even inflation. And this is really a market indicator of what the markets are predicting inflation, what it will be in the future. And the break-even inflation is just the difference between the yield on the Treasury securities and the Treasury securities that are inflation protected, the TIPS. And currently, as of 6/30/2019, that difference is between 1.6 and 1.8%, and that's across all different time periods. For instance, the 5-year inflation is 1.6, and the 20-year inflation is 1.8. So it's pretty consistent through all the time periods. And that's consistently lower than the what we were seeing last year at this time, and it was 30 to 50 basis points lower than last year. Makita and Virus also have lower assumptions on inflation, about 2% over a 10-year period. So we are proposing that we reduce the current assumption from 2.75 to 2.5.
So on that, I just wanted to take a minute to discuss that. If you look at the market-derived rates, and those market-derived rates are based on really a large number of securities. In the case of treasuries, trillions of dollars. In terms of TIPS, probably several $100 billion. So it's a fairly robust metric. And if I go back to 2009, and just sort of 10 years ago, and the numbers have been lower from that market-derived metric, and apparently consistently right.
Well, they've moved around some. We're just showing the 10-year look back and then last year. But,
Right, they've been all over the, not all over.
but you're right, they've been lower than the assumption.
Yeah. And they've been consistently in that 2% range. They have moved around, but not from 2 to 4, or,
No.
Right.
so basically from 1.9
Right.
to 2.1.
Yes.
That's kind of the movement there. So I'm just thinking whether the 2.75 going out 2.5, although it's conservative, there's a point, I think, there's a fine line being conservative and accurate and conservative and just wrong. So I'm just wondering if, you know, it's great to be conservative, but I think to the extent that we want the numbers to reflect our best estimate, whether that is still on the high side, the 2.5. And that's sort of consistent with what Drew has mentioned about perhaps a structural shift in inflation downwards. And I'm not certainly suggesting going much lower than, say, 2 or 2.25, but going from 2.75 to 2.5 seems conservative, but probably off the mark.
My sense is what might be valuable here is to let you go through the presentation so that you can tie all this together for us, so that way we can see what the impact of our decisions are going to be. I feel like these are really, really good questions, but as I'm starting to think through this, I'm feeling like it's not allowing us to get to the impact on the plan. And maybe if we get to the bottom of this, then we can come back and revisit what those little knobs are. We might adjust.
That's great.
Yeah, I think that's great. The one thing I do want to note here is in terms of the consistency, when we get to the discount rate, we're basing it on Makita's capital market assumptions. And so being consistent somewhere with Makita's range of inflation is important.
So we talked about wage inflation a little bit already, but wage inflation can be thought of as basically across-the-board increases for the active members, and it's also the minimum individual salary increase that we use in the valuation to project members' salaries until they retire. And wage inflation is generally greater than price inflation to account for increased purchasing power. And the current assumption right now for wage inflation is 3.25%, and you can see that's made up of the price inflation of 2.75% and 0.5 or 0.5% for the real wage growth.
And then the 0.5% real wage growth, that's been sort of consistent with the experience in the city?
Next slide.
Yep. Good. So a segue into the next slide is that this is looking at the historic look at how wage inflation and inflation in the San Jose area has been different than the local governments. The wage growth is on the top, then inflation and the real wage growth. And you can see for San Jose that we've had consistently higher wage growth than the other local governments and higher inflation. But bottom line too is that the real wage growth is higher than we've seen nationally as well. So even if we're considering reducing the inflation by that 25 basis points, we believe we should hold that wage inflation constant at the 3.25% based on this data. So basically by reducing the inflation, as we've said in the earlier slides, is that it really doesn't have a direct impact on the valuation.
Got it. I just wanted to.
Because we're going to we were recommending keeping the wage inflation assumption the same, which means increasing the real wage growth assumption by 25 basis points.
I just wanted to be sure I hear you. You talked about consistency among the various inputs.
Right.
And so if the 3.25 was derived by 2.75 plus a half.
Right.
If we go down from 2.75 to 2.5, shouldn't that number be a total of 3%?
Well, we would increase that 50 basis points for the real wage growth to 75 basis points. So go back to the previous slide. There, see the equation there? If we reduce the price inflation from 2.75 to 2.5, we're recommending increasing the real wage growth to 0.75%, so that the wage inflation assumption would stay constant at the 3.25%.
Okay. It seems to me that the consistent thing would be to get it to 3%. It also is consistent with what we've experienced over 20 years. In fact, over 10 years, you've had a wage decrease of 87 basis points.
So
And in the
part of
five-
this is
Well,
including
that
the
would-
history of the change in freezing wages for a period of time, pay cuts that took place that distorted these numbers. And I do want to point out.
And those happened right after the Great Recession, too.
Right, right.
Right.
Fortunately, these are the easier topics that we're covering today, price and wage inflation. When we get to amortization, discount rates, these are going to be the harder discussions. So keep that in mind as we're going through this.
Right, so the
information.
5-year, if you, just in the last 5 years, the real wage growth has been 1.2%.
Right, so I would suspect that's kind of a little rebound from the depressed wage growth after the Great Recession.
Correct.
And
Yep.
if anything, you might see a downward shift if there's any reversion, yeah.
So the amortization payment increase rate, as Bill had mentioned, that we have not looked at this as a standalone assumption before. It was introduced to you at the retreat. We started talking about breaking away this assumption from the wage inflation, because typically we've made, the two have been made the same. And so what that means is that when we calculate an amortization payment schedule, we calculate it with the 3.25% inflation, wage inflation, which means that the UAL payments will increase by 3.25% every year until the end of their amortization period. And since it's set at the 3.25%, theoretically, this amount, the amortization payment as a percentage of payroll will remain constant, because payroll is expected to increase at that same percentage. However, if the payroll doesn't grow as fast as expected at that 3.25%, your amortization payments are going to increase as a percentage of pay over time. So we did look and had some ideas about what we could do with this new assumption, and it's really appropriate given that when we looked at the projected city revenue growth, and I know we couldn't really pinpoint exactly what that number was, but it's somewhere between 2.75 and 3%, which is really, the city payroll is the revenue is a proxy for the San Jose payroll. So basically what that's saying is that the San Jose payroll could be increasing at a lower rate in the short term. So making an adjustment to your amortization schedule to account for that is a more conservative way of looking at it. You could also look at having that amortization payroll increase rate at 2.5%, or even a level dollar amount, which is 0%. But a level dollar amount is like you would have in a mortgage, just a flat dollar amount over time. All of these alternatives that we're discussing here are, all of these amortization rate increase rates are lower than the current wage inflation assumptions. So what that means is initially it would increase the dollar payments on your UAL, but over time it will lower the payments. And do you?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, the reason the inflation got brought in there is I was on a panel speaking, and one of my other panel members was an actuary for S&P Global, the bond rating agency, and he said that's one of the things they've started looking at is if your payment increase rate is too high, they get concerned, particularly if it's a long amortization. We don't have what he would consider a long amortization. But he said they have been looking more and more at trying to see what it would look like if it was at inflation. And if the increase rate is significantly above inflation, it causes concerns on their part, or can add to their concerns. So, that's why we threw in inflation as a potential increase rate to target.
Is there a possibility of looking at another alternative, which is that this number around a certain median, say 2.5% or 2.75%, or inflation 2.5%, center around any of those numbers, that the numbers go up and down with the revenues of the city, so that the burden of the city falls when its revenues fall, the burden rises when its revenues rises, but you still get an average that is consistent with whichever of these three options we choose.
So, we'll show you here, but this ends up being if you're talking about the difference between 2.5 and 3 1/4, it ends up being a real refinement as opposed to something that moves the needle significantly. So, I think to address the situation you're talking about, we probably need something that has a little more oomph in moving the needle.
Okay.
So this chart shows just 3 of the different amortization schedules. The 3.25% is like our baseline, and it's the green line. The 2.5 is the yellow line, and that's showing that in the beginning, it starts at a just slightly higher level than the 3.25 baseline, and is increasing over time by 2.5%. And you can see at the end of this payment schedule, the payment at the 2.5% schedule is lower than the initial 3.25. And then the level dollar amount is the blue line across the top of the page. All of these options are reasonable, and basically a lower payment growth rate results in a more conservative contribution strategy. So we're considering reducing the amortization payment increase, particularly after Bill gets done discussing some of these amortization smoothing methods. It may give some relief. I mean, the smoothing methods would get some relief, so it would almost be an offsetting item.
Can you just clarify what the y-axis is here? I don't see.
The y-axis is the amortization payment amount. It's a dollar amount.
How many dollars? It's invisible to me.
I think it's just hypothetical, theoretical, yeah.
Okay.
Just showing the
Yeah,
pattern.
the pattern,
Okay.
exactly. So as Vince said, moving on to the more exciting, more impactful assumption, the discount rate. Going back to an equation that investment consultants and actuaries use all the time, it's the C plus I equals B plus E. C plus I is the contributions plus investments. The B plus E is benefits plus expenses. So if the inflow to the plan is the contributions plus the investments. So if you set your expectation for the investments to be at a higher level, you're going to get lower contributions. And then vice versa, if you set the investments to be at a lower level, you're going to get higher contributions. But let's say in your circumstance from last year, the investment rate of return was slightly lower, I believe. Or the assumed rate of return for the plan is slightly lower than the expected rate from Makita. So you're setting your investment returns slightly lower. But if over time you see those contributions, or you see the investment returns being higher than your expected rate, you're going to see that the contributions will be lower, because the actuarial process is a self-correcting process. It's basically the fact that you set this discount rate is more of a budgeting tool than anything, because the actual returns are really what is going to drive the cost of the plan. And over time, we show how the change in the discount rate for San Jose, what has changed. And from 2009 to 2018, there has been a change in the discount rate almost every year since 2009, and a lowering of the discount rate. So looking at historical performance is one way we look at setting the discount rate. Just for some context, though, it's not the primary focus. And the bars are the returns on the market and actuarial value of assets, and the line is the assumed rate of return. And it's important to point out here that out of the 11 years, 5 of these years, you've had market value returns above your assumed assumption, but only one of those years where the actuarial value was higher than the assumption. So this is looking at your peers in California and the distribution of their discount rate assumptions over time. And you can see that back in 2007, the rates were up around 8% and have slowly come down over time, where now we're seeing rates as low as 6.5% and the highest at 7.4%. And San Jose Police and Fire, you've kind of led the pack in that reduction, starting in 2010, and have consistently stayed either the lowest or in the lowest 25th percentile. Currently, San Jose is no longer the lowest discount rate in the state. There's actually 2 now that are going to be at 6.5. One is San Diego and San Mateo just reduced their discount rate and their inflation rate to 2.25%.
So you just recommended, well, Ken recommended to decrease the price inflation to 2.5. So what does that mean about the discount rate? No, I know, but I mean, isn't price inflation part of the discount of the assumed rate of return?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we're getting there. Okay, now I'm going to pass it on to Bill to continue this discussion.
So we've already talked about this today, and we've talked about it in the past, but one of the big things that's happened to plans is the reductions in market interest rates over time have caused plans to do a combination of 2 things. One is reduce their assumed investment return, but even more so, they've had to take on more investment risk. And so we use as just a simplified measure of the expected or implied risk premium as the difference between the assumed return and the yield on the 10-year treasury. And you can see, even if you throw out the 80s, even in 1995, the yield on the 10-year treasury was above 6%, which made it a lot easier to try and target an 8% return. Today, well, as of June 30th, it was around 2%. I think it's even lower today. I can't recall where the latest market gyrations moved the 10-year.
About 1.52.
Yeah.
Give or take a couple of basis points.
So the implied risk premium today, even with our 6.75, is as high as it's ever been. The low interest rate environment just makes it very difficult to achieve those levels of returns. Now, historically, plans in general have set their expected return to be equal to the expected return over a very long horizon. And there are 2 things that we've tended to do differently, and there's an overall trend to do differently. One is, given the uncertainty in those investment returns, to think about an expectation that might be that you might be expecting to beat more than 50% of the time. So instead of just selecting the median, creating some margin from the median. And we've traditionally looked at that. The other thing is we get short-term assumptions and long-term assumptions. And traditionally, we just said pension plans are really long-term and focused on the long-term assumptions. There's a bigger recognition, given the size of our retiree obligations and so forth, that there's a very significant portion of our liability that is much shorter term. And we have to live through the short term to get to the long term. And so we're placing more and more weight on the short term. And just to give you kind of a rough measure, out of the present value of all the future benefits we expect to pay to current members, just current members, not new members, About 40% of that present value is paid within the next 10 years, 70% within the next 20 years. So we do want to consider the shorter-term assumptions as well. We've traditionally looked at your investment consultant and what their assumptions are. We compare them to other investment consultants, and we put some slides in the appendix to do that comparison. But given that they are your consultant, they understand in particular, the alternatives and private market classes that you have better than what we can get out of just a generic set of capital market assumptions. We tend to give preference to your consultant to the extent that they're not deviating their assumptions from what other consultants are doing. The thing we note this year is that the expectations are significantly higher than they were a year ago. And so we're going to talk about that in a couple slides. But there were two things that changed. There's a change in asset allocation, and there's a change in the capital market assumptions. Last year, Makita's 10-year return was 6%. This year, it's 7.2. Roughly 30 basis points of that 120 basis point change is due to the change in asset allocation. The rest is due to the change in the capital market assumptions.
Say that again, Bill.
So about 30 basis points of the 120, or actually their return was 7.4. We weren't able to match their 10-year quite right. We may have, it may be a rounding issue, it may be something else, but somewhere in the range of 120 to 140 basis point change in their 10-year expected return. 30 basis points of that was due to the change in asset allocation, and the remainder was the change in the capital market assumptions.
So if all we did was look at the classic trade-off between risk and reward, that would imply we should raise the discount rate by about 30 basis points.
For the change in asset allocation.
Just risk and reward, right?
Yeah.
Right, okay. That's what I thought you said.
But so we looked at these assumptions and seeing the significant change. Makita's not alone in having made the significant change from last year to this year.
Bill, I'm sorry, I apologize for interrupting. Those capital market assumptions, I'm assuming that from last year were impacted by the huge downturn in the last quarter. You were going to get there? Okay.
That's right here.
Okay.
It's on slide 19.
I apologize. I'm
Okay,
so sorry.
Here's what I want to propose for us, and I appreciate you commenting on that. I'm going to shift us a bit back to our normal Robert's Rules of Orders, so that if you do have a question or a comment, raise your hand, and I'll call on you, because I really want them to get through this, because a lot of the information that we're getting, we're going to see that as they go through the presentation. Then we'll come back and try and fill in the blanks here. Okay? Thank you.
Yeah, so the capital market assumptions that Makita set, and most investment consultants, they set each December. And so the issue with this year's capital market assumptions is December 2018 was a very different point in the market than either before or since. And so we show in the top part of the table just some measures of the market. And you can see the 10-year Treasury yield went from 2.4 in December of 2017 up to 2.83 and then down to 2.07 as of June. The S&P 500 had fallen, and then it recovered in the first half of the year. There have been adjustments, I guess, in this quarter. CAPE is the cyclically adjusted price earnings ratio, which affects valuations of stocks. So those are just a few of the measures that might go into setting the expected returns. If you look at the bottom part of the graph, we selected just some of the asset classes to show you the difference between last year's assumptions and this year's assumptions. And so, like short-term bonds, the expected return increased 100 basis points. Large cap stocks about 50. Some of the international stocks increased over 200 basis points. And with the changes in the market, the question is that the right basis we should use now to set our expected returns? And I guess our view is we should be a little bit skeptical about the optimism that's represented in those December capital market assumptions, not because there's anything wrong with them, but because they were based on conditions in December. And those are not the prevailing conditions today. So our starting point is that we think 6.75 remains a reasonable assumption. We don't know how to adjust all the asset classes for the changes in the markets over the last 6 months. And Makita doesn't address those on interim periods. They only address them annually. So we don't have a robust model to make that kind of adjustment. So any questions on that? I'm going to move off of the discount rate. Yeah, I know.
I'll allow one question because,
There was just a typo there, S&P 500 of 8,321.
Yeah, I'm not, I need to go back and look at what that was. We were
those-
pulling it from an Ibbotson database, but it
those-
should
those
be
aren't
like
accurate numbers.
2,900.
yeah.
Okay. The other topic we wanted to talk about came from the retreat, where we were talking about the amortization payments, specifically the Tier 1 amortization payments, and the pattern that that results in for costs. So we showed this chart at the retreat, but to refresh your memory, our amortization payment is made up of a lot of different components. For each year, there's a gain and loss, there's assumption changes, and then any other changes, we set up separate amortizations. And so this chart shows the light yellow are payments for gains and losses projected into the future, the light purple for assumption changes, and then there are a couple light green for benefit changes. And they are put in order of when they are expected to be paid off. And the blue line is kind of the net payment. And the thing there were two things that we've talked about specifically with this pattern. And the first is that we go from this rate here, and then we reduce it because these two amortization payments have been paid off. These are from 2005. They've been paid off, and so that reduces the net contribution. But then 2 years later, we have an increase, and that increase is because we finished recognizing a gain that we got in 2007. And then we go out a couple more years, and we've paid off the loss from 2009, and then we start this significant drop in contribution rates, which then bounces back up when we've recognized the 2011 gain. So one of our objectives is to provide some predictable and stable contribution rates. And so the thought was, maybe we don't want these periods where it goes down and then back up. And we are going to layer more on top of this, but that's not going to affect this basic pattern. We're going to have this basic pattern of it going down and back up. And then we also maybe don't want such a steep drop here. We'd rather smooth this out a little bit. But we certainly don't want it to drop all the way down and then the next year bounce back up. That is the opposite of stable contributions for the city's budgeting purposes.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
and we have broad latitude to do that, right, Bill?
Yes.
Okay.
So, what we've talked about doing is making some adjustments to the periods for some of these amortizations to try and smooth that out. And so there are a lot of options available, and they'll all have slightly different characteristics. So this is not the only solution, but this is a solution that we came up with to kind of consolidate these amortizations from 2007 through the gain in 2011 to a common 7-year period. So some of these, like the gain from 2007 that only has 4 years left, we're extending. But then the loss from 2009, we're also extending. And the gain from 2011, we're shortening. And then there was one other blip out there. So we were suggesting changing the gain from 2014 to extend it 1 more year to address that. What that does is that creates this blue line as opposed to the red line. So you can see we're slightly lower over the next 4 years than what was projected. And then instead of going up, we stay fairly consistent, but we extend 1 more year than we would have under the current schedule. And then we don't drop as far. And then we continue our migration down. We still pay off the UAL at the same time. The real difference is just right in this period. But there are some slight reductions here. Now, I would say also, these are only the amortizations from the 2018 valuation. So we already knew that we were smoothing in some losses on the asset side, and then we didn't meet the expected return this year. So our actual amortizations are likely to be higher. We still don't know what our experience is in terms of the demographic experience. People retiring, salary increases and all of that. We also don't know the effect of assumption changes. So there are some variations there. We have a model we can play with, but the reason I'm bringing it up is not really to play with it so much as to show you this table over on the right shows the percent of total pay that would be made for the UAL payment only. These are not the total contribution rates, just the UAL payment. And then if you make these changes, this is what the new pattern would be, and here's the change in the pattern. And so it would reduce it, it's expected to reduce it about 1.4% of pay for the first 4 years, and then 7.3% for those 2 years where it bounced back up previously. But then it's higher by 12% and 11% for 2 years before dropping down to numbers that are very close to the ongoing. So that's the trade-off. It's a trade-off in years to smooth the pattern and make it a more consistent part of the budget. So we're at the decision points. And as I suggested at the beginning, it would be good to get decisions on anything you can decide today to limit the number of decisions next month. But we don't need absolute final answers until next month.
Before I open it up for questions, I want to point out on slide 21, I did have a conversation with Bill around this. You can't imagine the number of options he could create here, right, in trying to put together a fairly smooth amortization schedule. So the least amount that we start to tinker with this, the better. I'm
Yes.
trusting the professional advice that we're getting, the work, all the scenarios that he's ran through to get to this. You're looking at really 6 changes here, and that's really important to keep that in mind as we think about that. So, back on the decisions, I think it's going to be important as we think about this. You commented, number 1, on the amortization schedule does not increase the UAL total payment that we will be making over time. Correct?
Right, we're still paying off the UAL in the same time period.
Okay.
There's an adjustment the significant adjustments in years 4 to 7.
All right. You pointed out that the price inflation and wage inflation tie together, and really that's more of an impact of what you think that real return is in terms of the difference between the two. And obviously the discount rate, you spent time talking about that, so that was valuable, particularly if you didn't really get the points of the fourth quarter of 2018. Makita's valuation was at that endpoint after the market sold off, which means future returns are likely going to be higher. We've actually captured a fair amount of those future returns in the first 9 months of the year. So if you were to look at, on page 18, the 50 percentile last year was 6% instead of 7.2. And the 20-year was 7% instead of 7.8. It's really important to keep that in mind, because I don't want this to have too big of an impact on how you think about the discount rate, because I know, Drew, that was a little bit where the path you were going on. So Vikas, I think you had a question?
Yeah. First, I want to compliment Bill and Ann for this smoothing that you've done. I think this really does help. Without spending a lot more time, is it possible to make some additional adjustments so that that line is flat or lower? So the payments are equal to last year or lower, but not higher. So that would, obviously I don't know which numbers would have to be adjusted. For example, that bump up between, 26, 7, that slight rise there, and so on.
Well, so if you look over here at the percent of pay, the proposed meets that standard on the percent of pay.
Okay.
It doesn't meet the standard on the dollar amount, but that's because we've got built in this 3.25% increase that Ann talked about. If we change that to 0, then you're meeting that requirement. But now you're looking at a 4% increase in the contribution in the first year. If we went all the way to 0.
Yeah. Can I follow up with one more question? On page 23, slide 23, I'm sort of left scratching my head here a little bit, and that's more because I'm less informed than all the other trustees, and not because of anything you've done. But when we create the amortization schedule, that already increases, all kinds of liabilities by various numbers, so to have an additional increase by 3.25%, it seems like double counting. You've already built in lots of increases in a lot of the underlying costs. When we come up with what is to be amortized, that already includes lots of increases. So why increase it any further?
We're just talking about how you pay for that increase. So we assess how much assets we think you should have, compare it to what you do have. That difference is $1 billion. And then this is our schedule for how we're going to pay off that $1 billion. And we're just saying that the underlying basis for those payments is that the payments themselves would increase at 3.25% each year. And the original idea of that, and it's very common across all plans, is that makes those payments a level percentage of pay, because we expect pay to increase 3.25% each year.
So I probably shouldn't be opening the floor to the discount rate discussion, but I apologize to the board. I will miss the next board meeting, which is to some extent the most important board meeting of the year. I have to chair a meeting in China. I tried to move, but I couldn't get out of it. So I'm really looking at you, Vince, because you really sort of kicked this off in 2012. There's a coherent narrative underlying all this, and coherent narrative is that we sort of figure out how much risk we're willing to take on. And we've said, I think partly in reaction to the city and to the mayor, that we're willing to take on more risk because the city is strong. And I think when we take on more risk and adjust our portfolio to generate a slightly higher return, I think it's incumbent on us to slightly raise the discount rate. From 6.75 to 6.875, we tend to raise it in eighths. And I think politically, if we don't hold true to that axiom, I think we're going to send the wrong message to our members, to the city, and so on. I think we dialed the risk way down, and I think, Vince, you said a couple of years ago, I think we've over-dialed that risk. I think the mayor and the city council come back and said, guys, we're pretty strong. You can take on a little more risk. Not a lot. Nobody in the city said, oh, stick it all in, high-risk stocks. But we did tweak that knob consciously. And I think anytime we tweak that knob consciously, and our financial people say, that's why I asked you that question, Bill, yeah, when you take on that much more risk, that much more volatility, we should see about a 30 basis point increase over time in our return. I think we should reflect that by raising our discount rate. And I won't be here in November to make that argument, but I think the argument is just that simple.
Okay. Prabhu, I'm going to go to you in 1 second, but I want to respond to that. Bill, when you were commenting on that slide of the 50 percentile and the fact that we've actually had a return expectation that's been different than our discount rate, part of it is that we wanted to philosophically have a greater probability than 50-50 of actually meeting the assumed return. And I know we've had the discussion, particularly at our retreat in April, about intergenerational equity, and if you move too far from that 50 percentile, then you start to impact them. But if I sat down with any one of you individually and said, you've got this much money, I think you might live this long, I think there's a 50-50 chance you're going to make it, you probably wouldn't want to rely upon that plan to get you from here to end of life. So that to me is a little concerning. Secondly, the fact that we actually have a difference in assumed return and expected return in the plan helps us tackle the UAL. That's intentional. We haven't seen the city increase additional contributions to the plan. I think Councilmember Deb Davis brought that up at our joint meeting with the boards and the city council. Is that could be an action the city could take if they wanted to knock down the UAL. It is actually our intention of reducing that AOL or UAL a little bit more quickly by having that differential. So I actually, I would be opposed to raising the discount rate. At the same time, I would actually be opposed to, at this point, lowering it. I'm going to go to Prabhu in a minute, and he may have a different view as our CIO. But one of the things that we need to keep in mind, and we haven't seen this data yet, is that when we go to do the next valuation in 2019, we did not meet our assumed return. That means when we sit and look at these numbers, likely next month, we're not going to be 77% funded. Our funded ratio is likely going to be lower. And do we want to pile on and lower our funded ratio even more by lowering the discount rate? The last point I want to make, Drew, of
Yeah.
raising the discount rate, and it's very simplistic, and I know there's a lot of ways of looking at your assumed returns, but looking at the risk-free rate and building from there, that chart that they had, which showed the 10-year Treasury at 2%, today is closer to 1.5%. If that's a building block, and we're lowering the foundation, but we want to assume that we're going to actually hit higher returns, that's quite a leap. So those would be my responses to that.
Yeah.
If you're happy to counter if you want, and then
Yeah,
Prabhu, I want to turn to Prabhu
let me give you a
next.
quick reaction. That actually makes a lot of sense to me. I think we can send a message that says, look, we have dialed up the risk, but we're not going to reflect that just yet in the discount rate. And here are the 4 or 5 good reasons you've said, Vince, to do that. I'd be very comfortable with that. But let's send that message, right? Yes, we've heard you, Mr. Mayor, City Council. We've dialed up the risk. Give us a chance to absorb that. We're not going to lower the rate. I think lowering the rate would send the wrong message. And the second point is something you and I have gone round and round on this for 5 or 6 years, Vince. And I'm supportive of you in this. And you reflected that, strictly speaking, when we say, well, better than 50-50, we're doing something with kicking a can around. But there's an old saying in Silicon Valley that somebody has to own the schedule slip. Because if you tell engineers it's due in September, it gets delivered in November. And if you tell sales it'll be in September, they start selling, and it just crashes. And somebody needs to tell the engineers it's coming out in September, and somebody needs to tell the sales guys, and you don't get to sell it till November. And so I'm actually very comfortable, Vince, when you say, okay, we are going to own the schedule slip. And the way we're going to own that, Murphy's Law, somebody pays us bad news, is we're deliberately going to kick the can towards us a little bit. And I am comfortable with that, but let's acknowledge that that's what we're doing, right? We're doing the opposite of kicking the can down the road. We're sorry, city, for that, but we've seen what happens to other plans when they kick the can down the road. And so we're going to own the uncertainty in the plan. Part of the way we're going to do that is to put a little buffer in there. I'm actually very comfortable. Everything you've said makes sense to me. I'm very comfortable supporting that. I just want to make sure that when we message this out to people, and you've done a great job. Everything you said in your messaging was everything I've been saying all along. So I'm very comfortable with that. I would be very supportive of that. I won't be here at the meeting next month, but that makes a lot of sense to me.
And that's a great point, Drew, that our messaging needs to be clear on why we're selecting this kind of a discount rate. The other factor that I failed to talk about is, although the market's bounced right back this year from the canyon that we were in the fourth quarter of last year, we're back at these richer levels today. And to expect higher expected returns, you actually need to have cheaper markets.
Yeah, right.
I mean, that's what we got from Makita in December. The markets were cheaper, the future returns were higher. Well, if the markets recovered, that means the future returns aren't still higher today as they were in December. Prabhu, let me turn to you, and then Vikas.
So I just want to make 2 points, so trustees are well informed next month when you make the decision. Just to add to, so the first one's going to support lowering the discount rate, and the second point is going to support increasing the discount rate a little bit. So firstly, so Bill mentioned, okay, so Makita's expected return went from 6 to 7.2, and it is true that Makita does not provide expected returns mid-year. But to your point, Vince, so whatever we lost in the fourth quarter, in the snapback in the first quarter, we got all of that. So it's fairly safe to assume that the expected return is back at 6%. I think that's a reasonable assumption. It's not 7, it's closer to 6. Since then, we've had more of a normal market exit for the last week. The second thing, the board did make a decision to increase risk. This is in support of slightly increasing the rate. And we went, our standard deviation, I'm just using Makita's numbers, went from 11 to 12.5, pretty big jump. And our expected return on a 10-year forward-looking basis went from 6.9 to 7.5, 60 basis point jump. And we made this decision in August. So our expected returns are, projected on a going forward basis, 60 basis points higher Whether we'll actually realize that or not is a different question, but we have dialed up the risk a little bit. So those are the 2 points I wanted to make, and I just thought of a third point, which actually a Fed trustee pointed out, and it's.
We keep it the same, right?
But a Fed trustee pointed this out, and so it's been working on my mind ever since. And it's more of a behavioral thing, right? So if you lower your discount rate, you then start, Makita looks at that, and then you start building a portfolio that can be a little bit more conservative. And that may have happened in the last several years. We are not expecting great returns, and therefore we're trying to be a little bit more conservative. If we had a slightly higher discount rate, would we think about asset allocation slightly differently? Just things to keep in mind.
Vikas?
I'm just reminded of why Harry Truman always wanted a one-handed economist. Back to what Drew said earlier, you know, our standard deviation's gone up a bit. And so, given that the portfolio's Sharpe ratio hasn't changed much, it does argue for a modest increase in expected returns. I don't want to press that, but I think that is where I would, if I had a choice, I would say, we haven't been standing still. We have moved in the right direction in terms of shifting some things around in the portfolio, that the returns should be higher, at least expectationally. The other thing I just wanted to bring up is that we should not be targeting higher than 50% probabilities, because your example works wonderfully for an individual or for a family. I think where a lot of us make, I think, an error of judgment is that a plan is not a SADI, it's not a family, it's not an individual. A family doesn't have any other legs to stand on. We have a sponsor that has a AA rating, which is a higher rating than the majority of nations in the world. And that means that to target a 50-50 probability is actually the rational thing to do, so that you're not taking too much risk, not too little risk, just the right amount of risk. So those are my 2 points here. Yeah.
Okay.
Can I rebut, let me rebut that. Can you go to slide 14? So that's what my instinct tells me, but there's a little knot in the back of my head, and it says, and this is something we are going to work on over the next couple of years, what's the historic bias? Because that works if we're bouncing around our forecast. I'm pretty confident, we all believe this as part of the COLA, that we've consistently under-forecast our liabilities to the extent of billions of dollars. And that's probably due to retroactive benefit increases. That's pretty straightforward. So the question is, over a 5-year period, a 10-year period, a 20-year period, and this is who owns the schedule slip, do we consistently under-forecast our, here's the benchmark, how do we do against that? This is that, you know, whole alpha argument. And this slide would seem to say that, at least in the recent past, we have under-forecast. And I don't know if that's what that says. It could say a lot of different things. But that bias, that implicit bias, has to somehow get factored in. And so when Vince says, well, we want to hit it more than 50% of the time, I translate that in my brain to say, you know, Drew, one way, before we know the implicit bias, would just be to turn that knob a little bit until we know the implicit bias. And the fact, you talk about tree rings, Bill, the last offsite. The fact that you and I can't intellectually right now say, okay, so how much have we underforecast liabilities over a quarter century, 10 years, 5 years? Now, how much have we underforecast the assets and why? I think speaks volumes about the problems with the pension systems in California. And we're going to get at that. We've talked about that for years, Vince. I know you're a supporter of that, and that's what your offsites were about. So that's my problem, is my gut tells me that we have these biases both on liabilities, and the biases in liabilities, I don't know, right, are massive. But I'm guessing we also have a bias on assets. And how do we incorporate that bias? Maybe we should do nothing because we don't know yet, but it seems to be that we don't hit what we say we're going to do. And then the question is, do other plans hit what they say they're going to do? Is there a systemic bias across all the pension plans in California?
Eswar?
Yeah, so I'd agree with Vince. I don't think we changed the discount rate. I think the fact that we've dialed up risk means that we should hold ourselves to that higher standard. And if we do meet those higher standards in a few years, then we can go to the city and say, well, I mean, we can move that up, and therefore your payments are gonna go down. But I wouldn't make that change now, before we've seen the benefits of it.
And the reality is that these are just simply tools that directly impact contributions, more than anything else. And in a healthy economy that we've had for the last 10 years, we've used it as that tool to increase contributions into the plan. And conversely, what we talked about in the retreat and offsite was that in the event that we got into a difficult economic climate and the city's finances were to be impacted by that, we could use these tools to provide some relief to the sponsor. And at the same time, if assets went down, future returns would be higher, which may justify higher discount rates in the future. The other tool, which I've been very reluctant to use, has been changing the amortization time period, trying to keep that as short as possible. So as Drew said, we're not kicking the can down the road. I think we have probably one of the more realistic amortization schedules of the systems in California. That could be revisited also in a more difficult climate. But, just my thoughts in general. Others that, okay,
So,
Franco.
we've had this conversation before, and I always remind people the world's not flat, right? We're talking about this just strictly in the financial, but this is actually a much bigger picture. So, the first thing I will say is that there's two systems that are lower than us. We're tied with two others, so we have been leading the pack here in the discount rate. And what I'm basically saying is, I'm an advocate for leaving it where we are, and here's some of the reasons why. There's gonna be some uncertainty coming on. In the last 11 months, we've lost 100 police officers. There's gonna be a little lull the end of next year. That number's gonna go on for 5 years. We can't hire that fast. We've talked about some of the risk that we have in our plan. It's partially because we have more people retired than active, and we are going to struggle to hire. And I'm only speaking on the police side. PERF, which is Police Executive Research Forum, just came out with a very large article on public safety crisis, and they can't get people to do these jobs anymore. So hiring is becoming more of a problem, and we're gonna get into a large group of people leaving. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the cities, over the next few years, is also projecting some budget deficits. So, to your point about the plan sponsor being able to pay and us being able to give them a little bit of relief, lowering that discount rate right now is going to increase a contribution when they already know they're gonna be a little underwater.
Roberto. So my statements have nothing to do whether you should lower or increase the discount rate. And I know we have Jeff Rieger as our fiduciary counsel here this afternoon. But I feel compelled to use Harvey's words, except for the accent. Harvey's accent, yes. And it's to remind you that at the end of the day, you are a fiduciary to the members of the plan. Clearly, it makes sense to take in consideration everything, including, and it's an important factor, the ability by the employer to pay. But, I just feel compelled, if Harvey was here, he would tell you, at the end of the day, you need to make a decision that ultimately takes in consideration the best result for the members of the plan. And that includes everyone, active, retirees, deferred members.
And so I'll add to that.
I didn't mean to say this so that you will speak. You can, I'm just, yeah, okay. I just wanted to make that point.
You did it,
Yeah, thank you.
I agree with everything Roberto said. The fiduciary duty is owed to the plan, not to the employer. Every single decision you make should be viewed through the lens of what is good for the members. Having said that, sometimes what is good for the members is also good for the city, because you do have active members who are participants in the city, and when the city finances get in trouble, that might mean less pay, less jobs for the active members. There's case law directly on point that holds exactly that, including a case, one of our cases holds exactly that from 2017. So it's all part of the consideration. With regard to your level of flexibility in this realm, I consider this realm, these actuarial decisions, assumed rate of returns, amortization schedules, to me, this is the very heart of your discretion. This is, what you decide collectively as a board is the right answer. I don't really think there is not a right answer until you tell us what it is. So what's great is that you have these debates. Everything you've been doing today, you air it out, people make thoughtful comments, you reach a decision, and then it will absolutely be defensible. Everything that's been talked about today is within your discretion. Your actuary's telling you that, I'm telling you that. I think these smoothing ideas are great, personally. I'm not trying to tell the board what to do, but I love the work they've done. I mean, I love that they've shown you that it's all still within the range of reasonable approaches, and you're just smoothing out the chart so that you're not having massive ups and downs. But yeah, so I mean, like I said, Roberto is absolutely correct. But the plan sponsor is an important part of the members' interests. So you have to consider it all. It's all one big organic being that you need to take care of. But obviously the members come first.
All right. I'll come to you, Andrew, first. Go ahead, Andrew.
You know, I'm on board with pretty much everybody saying I'd like to keep the discount rate current. You know, it's important to pay off this unfunded liability as soon as we can. But I also am very conscious about the city and making sure their contributions don't go up too high. And it also affects Tier 2 too, because they pay 50% of the liability. On page at the very beginning, on page 3, it is already showing that from last year to this year, not including, I believe, the not hitting our target, the city's contribution is going to go from 80.8 to 82.6. So we're already capturing increase in contributions from the city and also.
Go 1 year forward from that. It
1
goes
year.
from 82.6 to 85.4.
Okay, so it's still going up by 300 basis points around roughly.
Yeah.
So we got to be, so if we lower the discount rate, you know, we're going to capture even more of a hit. And so I think by keeping it the same where we're at, we're still paying off the unfunded liability. We're still capturing a little more revenue or income coming into the fund. And I think we just got to keep it steady. I would hate to use all the tools in our tool belt that we've talked about, you know, changing the amortization schedule, ramping up the discount rate a little bit higher to provide relief for the city or the members, because I don't think we're at that point yet. We got to wait for that point. We don't want to use all our tools in our tool belt.
Because
I want to get to the bottom line, on page 23, where the decisions are outlined. I'm okay with all of the recommendation except one, and the one is the wage inflation. I think that is the one that is actually out of whack in terms of being inconsistent with the framework that Bill and Ann have laid out. If we lower the inflation from 2.75 to 2.5, I would say that wage inflation probably should come to 3%, and everything else, I believe, seems reasonable to me. I think, and in terms, I just want to address one thing about biases. Yes, there are biases in all systems and all, but we've tried to do what we can by relying on Makita, so that these are not our own individual opinions, but we've tried to externalize the inputs. So I would say that 6.75 clearly makes sense. Lowering it makes limited sense. I can see it going higher, but not lower. The only number I would change here is the wage inflation, to be consistent with the 2.5 plus 0.5, which gets to 3%, not 3.25.
Bill, and do you want to comment again on that piece? I think what I'm trying to understand is which one's more impactful, the inflation number or the wage number. I know that by lowering the inflation number, the only thing that's changing is the real wage growth. But you're focused on the wage growth number itself, the 3.25.
Right, so reducing the wage inflation will reduce the active liability. It won't do anything to the retiree liability that's already, that's 2/3 of our liability, but it would reduce the active liability.
Got it. So on page 10 of your presentation, you show the 20-year wage growth number sitting right around 3.25. So because I'm more focused on that than I am the actual inflation number, because that's what moves the needle here more than anything else. So I'm, for discussion's sake, gonna make a motion that we accept the recommendations that are provided here. One, on price inflation, consider reducing that from 2.75 to 2.5. Wage inflation, consider retaining that at 3.25. Amortization, retain the wage inflation component of that, reduce the inflation component of that. The discount rate, retain that at 6.75. And then finally, on the amortization adjustments, implement the changes that you have proposed.
Second.
Okay, so I have a motion, I have a second. Let's have discussion before we vote. So do you want to add anything more?
Well, I'm just
Deacon?
trying to understand what he just said. You said page 8?
Page 23 here. This is what,
No, you were mentioning it, something about 3.25% being consistent, so I
on
just
page
wanna-
10,
Page 10, okay.
if you go to the chart on page 10 and you look at the 20-year actual experience for San Jose, the wage inflation number has been around 3.27. That's, to me, the most important number. I would like to retain that. And I think what you're saying is that if you want to lower the inflation number, you want to lower the wage number.
Well,
I'd prefer not to lower the wage number.
I think the reason is, I think we have to act consistently and rationally. The 3.25% number, the 3.27, does not sit in a vacuum. It has arrived in the backdrop of the 2.75% inflation. So if the inflation, right, the wage growth has not happened in isolation, it's happened because prices have risen by 2.75. So if prices are expected to rise at 2 to 2.5%, 2.5 itself is quite conservative, then I would say the right number is probably closer to 3, not 3.25.
So let me just muddle the waters a little bit more. Because part of the issue is the inflation assumption we're setting is based on national inflation. Wage growth has that dynamic, but it's really tied to local inflation. And so we have an issue here where local inflation has been significantly different than national inflation. And so actually part of that reason for increasing the real wage growth is kind of reflecting a difference in the current markets between the local inflation and the national inflation. And you can see in the 20-year period, there was over a 50 basis points difference between national inflation and Bay Area inflation.
Yeah, and I would say it goes to what Franco was saying, it's tougher to hire, maybe partly because of, the hazard and all that, but also because they're getting other jobs, I guess, right? So maybe you have to pay more, and so you're conscious of that.
Dick?
I can support what you're saying. Right now in the county, there's 10,000 plus employees on strike, so your motion is well taken.
Okay. Gia?
I am in favor of those recommendations that Chiron has proposed. I think on the topic of amortization adjustments, I think maybe you could do some slight improvement on the years between 2026 and 2030. And I think in the cases where you've tweaked it a little bit, I think you can probably improve that slightly.
Take more of the kink out of it.
Yeah, I mean, you're going up only to go down, only to go back up again. I mean, it's definitely remarkably better than the red line. But this is a tweak, I mean.
So we're fine coming back with other alternatives. Let me state that. And I would, and this is exactly the kind of comment to drive that so that we could come back with the right alternative for you if you tell us what the objective is.
Mhm.
Let me set this back.
You don't have to do it now.
The key question is whether you look at it as a percent of pay or as a dollar amount. The chart is in dollar amounts, and then the table on the right is percent of pay.
Right.
So it goes up as a dollar amount, but down as a percent of pay.
Right. For practical purpose, the city is paying, and the employee, and the retirees, employees are paying out of pocket. And so that kind of volatility within those 4 years could be further smoothed, is what I'm suggesting.
Okay, so you're looking at wanting the
The dollar.
dollar amount to not increase in those
Right.
years.
I mean, you did a great job already against the red line. Here, you're just kind of constantly going up, only to go down drastically, only to go back up again. You just kind of there's still a little whipsaw there.
To follow up on Gia's comments, so you smooth out a few prior years by doing this. How far in advance should we be looking to do the smoothing out? So, to address the 27, 28 years that Gia's talking about, is that something we typically address 7 years in advance, or do we wait till 3 to 5 years prior?
It's a very good question. I don't think there's a fixed answer to that, except to say our amortization period is 15 years. So anything outside of 15 years, I don't think we should be touching, because we're going to have things that affect that pattern. Inside of 15 years, the pattern, although the pattern is set, but the level's not, because we'll layer other things on top of it. So the 7 years, I think certainly we can address it now. It's also small enough that if we waited a couple of years, it's not that hard to address, but that pattern's not really going to go away.
Yeah. Okay.
So, Gio, are you willing to accept the motion with them coming back at the next meeting, providing maybe one more look at a refinement that we could potentially vote on for just the smoothing of the amortization? Or do you want to accept what we have here?
Yeah, I don't want to stop accepting some of the bigger items here, such as the discount rate. But as a tweak would be to further smooth it. I don't think that that's going to affect any of the other decisions.
No, and we can come back with sort of A and B on this for you to choose from.
Yeah.
So I'm going to suggest we accept this motion if we get the vote on it, pending another look at the next meeting, including this current content, but then a third line of what that might look like if we adjusted further. Vika's last comment?
Yeah, well, I'm glad Gia mentioned that. I had mentioned this earlier as well, but I was persuaded by Bill showing me the numbers on the side, that the fraction seemed to be going in the right direction.
50% to 48,
Yeah.
46.
So I'm fine with living with this. I'm also fine with the improvement that I'd suggested, which is consistent with what Gia is suggesting, so. The numbers, the fraction are going in exactly the right direction.
Okay. So by way of show of hands, all those in favor of that original motion? Aye. Okay, any opposed? Nick, all right, aye, thank you.
Count me twice.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
A lot of work on this. It's
Before,
always a
can
tough
I
part
ask
of our meeting.
one more thing before Bill leaves? Bill, I just wanted to ask if you've had any updates on the tool that you were potentially going to provide the trustees who are interested in getting more education, so that it's not quite all the bells and whistles that you work with, but one that will help us understand all of the underlying nuances of these calculations.
Because, let me take that question. In fact, you made that, you reminded us at the governance committee 2 weeks ago. So I did reach out to Bill, and he very politely reminded me that he actually sent me some information on this about 5 months ago, I think. There's a cost to it. And so I'm just debating how to bring that request to the floor at a future meeting or talk to the board chairs first, because there is a cost associated with providing that to the trustees. And I think the cost is the same whether it's just one trustee or all trustees. Is that correct?
Right.
And so-
You would have a special login to a website.
Yeah,
to-
so,
to
you know,
enter.
my issue is, I guess, if it's gonna be a tool that is gonna be used by a good number of trustees, it will make more sense. If it's just gonna be used by only one or two, then, I don't know, it's not very expensive, but it is some cost associated with it.
Can
So
you give us an
it's a
idea
long
what-
way of telling you, I'm sorry?
Can you give us an idea what the cost is?
Yes, I believe there is an initial cost that Chiron is willing just to charge us for the initial cost, but not annually after that. Did I get that correctly? Or you're
No.
not charging us for the initial cost of setting it up?
No. What we suggested was that we would do both the police and fire and federated for the price we would normally charge for one plan.
And one
So
plan
that
is
would split.
$5,000 a
It's $5,000 to set it up, and then $500 per quarter that gets you the annual updates and.
Okay, so there you go. So it will be $500 per quarter plus $5,000 combined for police and fire and
For
federated?
both plans, yeah,
So $2,500 per plan,
yeah.
annually?
No,
No, that just to
that's
set
a
up.
one-time.
And then $2,000 a
it'd be-
year annually because $500 per quarter.
Right.
Okay, all right, so that's the cost.
So, Mr. Chairman, can we put that on the agenda for some future date to see if the board is willing to pay that cost?
Absolutely.
And
Or if a trustee is willing to come out of pocket for that cost.
I will put it in the next agenda for November.
Okay.
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Great. Yes, sir.
let me just, I just got to reading this in the county and city pension plans. They just gave me a little statement here. It said, in a nutshell, it says, how unfunded public pensions are in the United States. And it says basically $44 trillion throughout the United States. So, in my opinion, what we're doing is trying to do the best we can to make sure that people have money to retire.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to agenda item 5. Thank you both for attending. Service retirements, we have 4. Mark S. Alves, Police Officer, Police Department, effective November 2nd, 2019, with 25.2 years of service. Kevin P. McMillan, Police Officer, Police... Did I...
No, you're fine.
Oh.
Keep going.
That's right. How could I skip that?
Keep going.
I will come right, I will come right back to that. Thank you. Thank you. Come right back to that, the retirements.
Thank you, Roberto.
Aurelio, let me finish with Kevin P. McMillan, Police Officer, Police Department, effective October 5th, 2019, 25.86 years of service with reciprocity. Aurelio Rodriguez, Police Officer, Police Department, effective September 21st, 2019, with 27.3 years of service. Nicholas L. Speaks, Police Officer, Police Department, effective October 5th, 2019, with 25.14 years of service.
Motion to approve.
Okay, all right. A motion by Santos, second by Trustee Muyo. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? I'm going to continue with this, and I'll come back. We'll go through 5. We have 5.2A, Allen M.E., Police Sergeant, Police Department, effective October 13th, 2019, with 26.11 years of service. This was a deferred vest. Do I have a
Motion
motion?
to approve.
Okay, all right. All in favor? Aye. Okay. Let me back up to probably the most important item on the agenda. Really, it was not intentional that I wanted to pass by, giving up this chairmanship.
It was meant to be.
But 4E is nomination for the position of board chair for the calendar year 2020. And simply to start this off, I have to tell you that it has been fantastic working with Andrew over the last couple of years as the vice chair. He's extremely engaged. He asks great questions. And in fact, he's actually led a couple meetings now, which has been terrific to put him in that spot. I think he'd be a terrific choice, so I'm going to nominate Andrew to be the board chair for 2020.
Second.
Okay, I have a second from trustee Griarty. Is there anyone else that wants to bring forward any nominations? Andrew, you want to nominate yourself?
I think I have a month to think about it,
You
right?
do, you do. So now, the most important thing here to think about, though, is I think Roberto pointed out that we're in the application process or the election process, and you've got to make sure you get all those boxes completed and filled out.
Yes, it's due tomorrow at 5 p.m.
5 p.m.
So your policy says that you may accept or decline the nomination immediately, or may take the matter into consideration for the subsequent board meeting. So you have a choice.
Thank you for pointing that out, counsel.
If I get reelected to the board from my membership, but I'll be happy to accept it.
All right, terrific. So I'm gonna, do we need to do the vote on my nomination?
Yes.
Okay, so all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Terrific. Okay,
Very good.
that's exciting.
Congrats.
Now, moving on to item 6, death and survivorship notifications. After I read this, if we can have a moment of silence. Notification of death of Gary Flair, fire engineer, retired October 12th, 1971, died August 10th, 2019, no survivorship benefits. Victor Hernandez, police officer, retired July 15th, 2006, died July 15th, 2019. Survivorship benefits to Susan Hernandez, spouse. Jack Spindler, fire engineer, retired March 5th, 1985, died August 5th, 2019, no survivorship benefits. And Richard Thomas, police sergeant, retired January 10th, 1987, died July 16th, 2019, no survivorship benefits. We can have a moment of silence. Okay, thank you. Nick, Franco, Dick, any comments on the service retirements, the individuals that we have lost?
Yes, go ahead first.
Oh, well, sir, thank you, Mr. Chair. First off, to the gentlemen that are all retiring, good luck to all of them in retirement. I've had the pleasure of knowing them all and working closely with a couple of them, so continued success and good health to them. Also to Sergeant Lee. I did not have the pleasure of knowing Sergeant Thomas, but obviously on behalf of the board and myself, condolences to his family and friends. Vic Hernandez and I actually got hired together years ago and worked together in patrol and also worked a couple of extra jobs on occasion. Just a happy-go-lucky guy, really enjoyed being a police officer. He was a good police officer, and I'm very sorry to hear of his passing. So again, on behalf of the board, our condolences to his family and friends on his passing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Yes, the two firefighters that passed away, I worked with them for years at two different stations and had a chance to talk to Mr. Spindler right before he passed, and he was really active as a retiree. And they were good people and good firefighters. Thank you.
Okay. Franco, I don't know if you have any comments, or Andrew, on any of the other, particularly retirees?
No, just good luck to him in retirement. I worked with a couple of them, and congratulations.
All right,
I didn't know the PD, and we don't have any fire retirees.
okay. On to committee reports. There's not a lot except for one particular committee. We've got a bit to get through, and we'll get through that quickly. But let's start with the Investment Committee 7.1. Chair Griarty.
I've already done the report out last month. We did not meet because we're now meeting every other month now. So our next investment committee is in a few weeks, this October. And you guys have already discussed what we talked about mostly in committee.
Any questions? Your sense on the meeting is going to every other month?
I actually think that we may need to probably tweak some of the information to the investment committee a little bit more, just so that we can kind of have a good sense of what has been invested in, as opposed to just one line that we've already invested in. I mean, that's just kind of, now that we're moving to every other month, and then there's less data that we're seeing. So, I don't
Okay.
know, there's nothing to do right now, but we can discuss this at the next meeting.
Great, let's keep that in mind, because that's a big shift for both boards. Make sure it's working for everybody.
Yeah.
Just real briefly, we haven't met as the audit committee, but maybe Barbara, just give us 20 or 30 seconds on, we fired up the member portal, how's it going?
Yeah, we fired up the member portal, and earlier or later in September, we did a soft rollout to the staff in the office and a couple of the retiree rehires. They were distributed the same letters the retirement population are going to be getting later on this week, and we got good feedback. Yeah.
That's great, thanks, Vincent.
Good. Okay, 7.3, governance. Otto, you're up.
So we did have our meeting, I guess that was last month. The main objective of this meeting is what was identified by Tom, was that there were inconsistencies between Federated and our system in the governance committee charter, audit committee charter, board communications policy, board performance assessment policy, and the policy on the vendor selection. So the idea being that when staff has to respond to something, they have to go look at our specific document to see in which way it may be different than how Federated would do it, and trying to get them all in a line. And I think with the exception of about one item, correct me if I'm wrong, Roberto, we were pretty much in agreement with changing all the language. It was all minor tweaks. I think the one area was related to the communications policy, where we differed. Federated wanted a more, I think, liberal policy that allowed the chair to speak on behalf, and we kind of wanted to keep it narrowed down that the CEO would direct whoever's most appropriate to make those kind of communications. For example, if it was something related to legal, then he would have legal make it, or he would make it. If it was investment related, you know, the CIO would make it. And we, I think, sent that back to them to see if they would be okay, you know, morphing theirs, because I don't think they had a quorum.
No, they did not. I'm really impressed that your summary is really, really good. I actually have to refer to the minutes to do that, and I highlighted that particular issue. You are correct. There were some minor changes in all the ones that are listed here on action on item D, some minor changes. But then the big one was, you didn't have to make any changes, but Federated, to be in agreement with police and fire is exactly what you just indicated. So, because Federated Committee did not meet because they didn't have a quorum, we are intending to bring these items to their meeting in October, and they will deal with that there. Ideally, they will agree with your board approach on who should be the designated. It's either the CEO or the CEO designee, depending on the case, or general counsel, right? Which deviate from Federated. So I'm hoping Federated will be willing to take that input, but there's always a chance that they may not.
So I do have a question on, there's an overlap here between this item, which is D, and the policies, and E, which is the CEO-CIO charter. And it has to do with 7.3D10, the vendor selection policy. And in there, I want to make sure there's consistency, because I feel like some of the data is missing there. We have on the general consultant, and maybe this is intended, but it's basically talking about staff doing the due diligence, the interviews, the staff and the investment consultant or the investment committee are the finalists, and then staff recommends to the IC and the IC to the board. However, in other parts, it's more specific to the CIO. So who's making the recommendation to the investment committee and to the boards? Is staff and the CIO considered to be one? Because there's nowhere in here that it references the CIO in making the recommendation to the board or the investment committee on the general consultant.
I would say that staff and CIO are interchangeably, but I'm making a point to confirm that with with Tom to make sure that we're consistent. But I think when we refer to staff or CIO, we mean staff. But it should be consistent, you are correct.
Okay. And then the other part in this exact same area has to do with investment managers, and it states under appoint and terminate that the CIO, in concurrence with the consultants, selects the investment, I'm sorry, I don't mean investment managers, I mean investment consultants. Let's see.
Which one is that one then?
Where is the investment consultants? Okay. This is, again, 7.3D, number 10,
Okay.
on page 4. Investment consultants, the CIO appoints and terminates. And we know clearly we were delegating that, but there was one minor thing, which is in the CIO charter, which is the board approves all contracts. But that's not clearly spelled out here, and that's a really important thing. I just want to make sure that doesn't get missed, that it's not captured here in the vendor policy, that the board needs to approve the contract. And it looks like under appoint and terminate that the CIO does it all.
That's a class, actually.
You know,
that's a problem.
you know what that means is you should probably be a member of the governance committee.
Yeah.
It would have been very helpful if you would have been there.
You know, there's a lot of time and thought put into this, and I'm sure the intent is there, but it's not captured
Yeah.
correctly. So I think those two things are really important to make sure they're consistent by looking at the CIO charter and the vendor policy charter.
On your previous point, Vince, Harvey did point that out on the IPS, not for so much for this, but for the IPS. In some places it said CIO, in some places it said staff. And it is my understanding that Harvey wanted to, wherever it says investment staff, to be replaced with CIO. And, as the CIO is ultimately accountable for
That-
it.
Almost gonna come back with some of those changes.
That's
Yeah.
good.
So I will follow up with Tom, but that's a very good point.
So,
Yeah.
so can we take then maybe 7.3D10 and defer approving that until we get this cleaned up? And the same thing when we get to the CIO charter? That would be the only thing I would request, that those are cleaned before we actually approve those.
Well, so two things. I agree with you in the CIO and the CEO charter, because in the discussion, there was understanding that those have been dealt with by the JPC, by the Joint Personnel Committee. So they're going to come back after the Joint Personnel Committee have a chance to make whatever changes, suggestions they're going to be making after the matrix and everything else. So that's a separate issue. On this one, we certainly can take your approach, but I wonder, Mr. Chair, if you're willing to amend your motion to approve it pending the suggested changes or addressing the issues that you raise, as opposed to having to come back to your board. We can't do it that way if you just want to confirm that they were made, or you can approve it pending the issues that you raised to be addressed with Cortex.
Okay, so let me be clear. Prabhu, you're pointing out that Harvey says the investment policy says one thing, and that's maybe not consistent here. Let's stick with the investment consultants. So under the vendor policy for investment consultants, everything is staff, and then you appoint and terminate. Is that was also in the investment policy statement, or where's the difference in the investment
I'll have to
policy?
go back and take a look at it. I'm not exactly sure, but there was a place where instead of CIO, it said staff, and Harvey pointed out the inconsistency and said, no, it should actually read CIO. But I'll have to go back.
I prefer,
and-
Roberto,
Sure.
on that. We defer it and get that cleaned up.
We can do that, but yes, we certainly can do
I
that.
just don't want to approve something and find out that we didn't approve the right thing based upon what the investment policy says.
So what you're suggesting is that you approve everything except for did you?
7.3
Actually, you know what, do me
D,
a
number
favor.
10.
Can we look at 7.3D11, because that's the that's the revised, he's revising it there, and the 11 is the clean version, okay,
Yeah,
all right.
10 is just the marked up
Yeah.
version, so we can see.
The changes.
So
Uh,
basically, 10 and 11 would be deferred.
Okay,
The
all right,
CIO
we
would
can
be
do that.
deferred to
Yeah.
make sure that those are all
Yeah.
consistent.
There's a motion to approve the others.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, so you will have to.
I'm making that motion.
I'll second it.
Thank you.
Great.
Did you have, okay, comment, did Roberto? did you
No,
have-
no, I'm fine. I just wanted to make sure that we didn't forget about B and C, that's all. B is receive and file, and C is forward calendar for the Joint Governance Committee.
Okay, I'll go back to that since I'm out of order. So first on D and E, we're approving 7.3D1 through 9. And on E, we're approving 7.3E1 and 2. So I have a second from Drew. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay. Now going back to the minutes, I need to, we need approval on that or just note and file?
Just read
Oh,
them on fire.
okay, so 7.3B is just simply receive and file on that. You got that covered?
Yes, and then you did C?
Not yet.
Not yet.
No,
okay.
not yet, exactly, thank you. Okay, I guess now we're on to F, Franco, on the board self-evaluation. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping around.
Did you, I'm sorry, did you just say, did you just did C or not?
Yes.
We haven't done it yet.
We haven't done it yet,
We
right?
haven't done C yet.
Yeah. C is
Oh,
Board calendar.
approving, yes.
thank you. Bouncing around, continue. 7C is the forward calendar on that. Any, Franco, you want to lead the discussion on that, or?
It's just the calendar.
Yeah. I mean, you can approve it, that's what they agree, they're gonna take it, yeah.
Okay,
Since he stated discussion and action, you might as well just make a motion to approve it.
you want to make that motion?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Okay, any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
All right,
Mr. Chair, on E, you certainly can approve. E has to do with the CEO and CIO. He actually made the changes to have the charters to be consistent between the boards, but he also made the point that they're gonna have to come back before the governance committee because of the work that the joint personnel committee is doing. So you can either choose to defer this item until the JPC finalize the new changes, or you can approve it, understanding that it's gonna come back to you eventually after the JPC have the changes they're gonna be implementing here in those charters.
okay,
Well, and we already approved the CEO charter, so we would need to
Yes.
undo that if you're not gonna do that today.
Oh, you already approved the
He
CEO?
did that in his last
they were,
motion.
they
I'm
were
just-
put together.
I was the one that was
Sorry.
behind then, okay, I apologize. Is whatever your board's
But you
pleasure
can
is.
undo that if, based on what Roberto just said also, that's also
Okay.
always a possibility, so.
No? Okay.
So what does that mean? You approve the CEO,
We approve the CEO, we're not approving the CIO yet.
and I second that.
Okay, thank you.
That six-pack is not there.
Thank you.
All right, all right.
Okay, are we done?
No, you still have F.
Oh, my gosh. Franco, F. Sorry.
Did we talk about F? Why do I not
No,
really
this is
remember it?
just, you did talk about F, and I just quickly wanted to remind you, board, you should have received an email, but if you haven't, you should be receiving one. And they're gonna follow up with you to fill out the survey, and then they're gonna follow up with the question to talk about the survey. So is that happening already?
Yeah, I did my call
Okay.
on Tuesday.
Okay, good, then that's it, you don't really
So I
have
just
to.
wanna target
I think the
Yeah.
deadline was October 13th.
Okay, all right, so I just wanted to let you know of that, that's fine. There's nothing to, I mean, if you make a motion, you're just approving the memo that was provided and the work plan and everything else, but you're already working on the surveys, so it's up to you how you want to address that.
We're doing it.
Yeah,
We're already doing it. Do you
Yeah,
do you have a motion to
done.
approve?
I mean, it would be just helpful so that, because it's
You wanna make a
discussion and action.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Okay, any further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, motion carries. Sorry about stumbling through this governance stuff. You
Apologies,
definitely don't
yes.
want me on that committee. 7.4, disability. Chair Santos.
See October 7th at 10 o'clock.
Yes.
All right,
We didn't meet last month.
okay.
They can read.
All right, and then the last is the Joint Personnel Committee. We met on September 9th, and we're doing a great body of work in conjunction with Cortex to look at the evaluation, both performance measurement and performance management, that helps move us further in line with some of the observations that came in the civil grand jury report regarding how we do our reviews of our CEO and CIO. So we're moving along there. We did have a discussion on roles and responsibilities of the CEO and CIO, fairly robust discussion. Just as a reminder, a large body of work was done on that by the governance committee over a year and a half ago. That work lasted over 12 months or so. At this point, the joint personnel committee decided to continue with that structure and not change it, but we're certainly open to having further discussions down the road if there's a need to revisit that again. That's kind of the update.
Mr. Chair, can I remind you that the next meeting, by the time we issued the agenda, it wasn't determined, but it's still October 31st. We reissued the email to remind everyone in the committee that even though Trustee Chandra is not available, that we are going to bring an action item to the February meeting in October so that they can appoint another member so that there's quorum for the meeting. So we are still sticking with the October 28th. Monday, is it from 10 to 12 or 12 to 2? 12 to 2, October 28th, Monday, at our offices for the next meeting.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay.
And Tom is going to be present.
Okay,
Okay.
good. Proposed agenda items. I know we had some discussion on things that,
Yes, I
already
noted,
proposed
I
one.
noted the proposed request by Trustee Oswald.
okay? Public comments. Dick, do you want to provide the update, although on
No, I
this
just-
public, I think it's
I just gave it to
practically.
the chair. They had a council member, Chappie Jones, had a disability awareness today at the same time. I was planning to go over, but we had this meeting.
Yeah,
So
okay,
it was good. I'm glad that people are looking at it.
yep, thank you. Any other comments from the public? Okay. 12:57, just in the nick of time.
Good job.
Meeting adjourned.